Welcome to the Bible Forum. I'm Warren Sprouse. You're here with me. This is a segment I call the Counseling Corner. What is a mental disorder? But before I do that, I want to share with you a new book that I've run across. Actually, my pastor has written this book. He's written about a dozen of them. His name is John H. Hill. You can go to lulu.com, I think it is, and find a whole bunch of it. But he's just put out a new one, and I think this would be of real value to most Christians. It's entitled A Bible Handbook for the Layman. There are a lot of Bible handbooks out there. None of them do what this one is doing. Each book of the Bible is outlined in a very short, concise manner. The concepts are broken down into ABC or 1, 2, 3. A synopsis is given of each of the books, and you get to use that in your Bible study so you get some sense as to what's going on and why. I would encourage you to get this book. If you don't have access to a computer or you don't want to go to lulu.com or whatever, let me know. Shoot me an email, and I will make sure you get one of these books. I don't know what they cost. There's no price in here. I'd have to go online and try to find out, but I'll find out and give it to you. It looks like it's probably at least a $10 or $15 book. But as books go, that's not really a lot. It would also help you in your ministry to other people as you're maybe teaching in a Sunday school class or just sharing, trying to help someone with a problem. You'd have some resource for this. But here in this counseling corner, well, I want to talk to you about mental disorders. It's a term that we have used, society has used, that makes no sense whatsoever. You have to ask yourself the question, what is a mental? It's a disordered thing. What is it? Well, it's the mind. All right, I got the same question. What is the mind? It's not the brain. It is not the brain. And then how does it get disordered? And what is this disorder like? What's going on here? Now, I've discussed this in the past. I mean, this is a ministry that is sponsored by Alternatives Biblical Counseling and Education Incorporated. We've talked about this, not recently, but over the last 20 years that I've been doing this program, we've talked about it. But the news has brought it back into the limelight with the topic earlier in the show where I shared with you that a pastor has taken his own life. If you don't know where that is, it's the February 3rd, 2019 show, video number 2. And it shows up at the end of that video. There's several short things in there. But the psychological community has coined this phrase to describe a wide array of issues, none of them actually mental, and most of them not disorders at all. So the question has to be asked and answered, what is the mind? And once we can establish that, we then wonder, how does it get disordered? Not to mention, how can it be brought back into order? And who is to decide what that order is? The psychological community has a multitude of answers, not always agreed to by every branch or discipline under the umbrella of mental or psychological. Some of the disagreements are both immense and legendary. Under this umbrella are a number of disciplines. Psychiatry. Psychiatry is a medical doctor. He has the ability to dispense drugs. And psychology. These folks may be a doctor, maybe not. They are also behavioralists, and they provide something called talk therapy. They can't give you a drug. They just talk to you and try to help you sort things out and answer questions. And then in the category, there's also counselors. These are people who are definitely not medically trained and largely are offering talk therapy, very much like the psychologist, only not as structured. He doesn't buy into all. Christian counselors don't buy into psychology or psychological things, and if they do, you need to get away from them. And after these come a wide variety of therapies and cures that you see on television and online and everywhere. But the fundamental questions still plague us. What is my mind? I'm getting mental therapy. How do I fix a broken mind? Well, it's not broken, it's disordered. Well, how do I fix it? Is it even possible? And when and if I do, what will be the result? How will I know? Is there a standardized result, a place I can measure this? Today, a large part of mental therapy revolves around depression and or anxieties. It's the ups and the downs of life that seem to drive us. Are these behavioral problems? I have caused them myself by the way I behave? Or are they mental problems? Mental in the sense of the mind, and the mind being influenced by chemicals or by social issues or behavioral responses. That's reprogramming in a sense, or confusing my mind. And we still don't even know what the mind is. We think it's our brain, but it's not. And then if we're able to define all these things, we still have the question, what can be done to alleviate all of this? Now, most counselors, therapists, medical doctors all start at the end. They begin with assumptions. The assumption that these problems are chemical, or they're mental, or they're behavioral. Some can be alleviated or at least moderated with drugs, but only a medical doctor can dispense drugs. Of course, there are over-the-counter drugs that might help as well. But other counselors take a little bit longer because behaviors have to be established and maintained, and then you have to be able to communicate them. And there has to be some delving into your psyche and the way you think and the way you believe, the way you live, what's going on in your life. It could take a while. And after all that is finished, we've sifted through all that, you still got to find the cause. Which of the things going on is really the cause? I married this idiot. Is that the cause? Or I like sugar. Is that the cause? Or, I have a habit of banging my head against the wall. Is that the cause? Today, if you go to one of these professionals, it's going to cost you money, anywhere between $100 to $300 an hour. And if you're lucky, that's a 45 or 50-minute hour. It can be shorter. And you have to do that over many months. And there's no guarantee at the front door. Now, the questions, in many cases, are legion. But they become something like this. First of all, what ails people who are depressed? People who are excitable in an exaggerated sort of way. Or maybe some people who are just lethargic. Or what ails people who just seem to live a confused life, or a guilt-ridden life, or a fearful life, or a withdrawn from reality kind of life, or any number of other symptoms? What ails these people? What is it? And then after that, you ask yourself, how can they be helped? Can we cure this? We can't cure what we don't know to be a reality. We can't cure something we don't understand. It may be damage. It may be disease. Or just may be behavior. The answers to these questions lie in the human psyche, our immaterial being. They're not always intellectual. And until we know the cause, there's not going to be any treatment that leads to any kind of a cure. And until there's a cure, all we're left with is coping or medicating. Thirdly, the psychological community largely ignores, rejects the soul. They are focused on the immaterial mind. They deal in mental illnesses, mental malfunctions, mental diseases. All this misidentification of the brain as the mind leads to problems you don't even know about. Is the mind an organic member, or is it spiritual? Meaning that it's non-physical. And is this mind diseased? If it's non-physical, how do they get diseased? Is this mind damaged? Same question applies. If it's not physical, how do you damage it? Is the problem organic? You have a tumor. Oh, great, I have a brain tumor. That's my problem. Is it glandular? Is it chemical? Is the problem non-organic? Is it that I worry too much? I have fear, doubt, guilt, pride. Do I have to handle these extremes in personality? Non-organic problems can easily lead to organic problems if you don't treat them. Off the top of my head, I think of ulcers. And there's some forms of paralysis, not to mention stress. We all live under stress. But stress is destructive if there's not times when you de-stress. You can stress, but you got to be able to relax. You stay stressed, you're going to have a problem. And number 4, all of the above largely misses the mark. The physical, the psychological indicators are results. They're not the causes. We're looking at results. The damaging, debilitating feelings, the behaviors are not the problem. So until treatments are focused on cause, not result, there's no effect. There's no cure. Nothing changes. You just feel better because you're taking the drug, or you have this, or you sit in a corner for 15 minutes a day, and it relaxes you. Nothing has changed. Where results are physical, you can treat the result as you would any sickness or any damage. But you dare not confuse the two. If you do, you risk treating the result, not the cause. And this whole exercise simply becomes a Band-Aid, a very expensive Band-Aid. Do you see the problem? The psychological community is notorious for misnaming causes. Their whole aura, their whole thing they deal with is mental disease, implying a mind disease or disorder. And they haven't even touched the mind. They're notorious for creating the idea of a sickness to attach to problems, then treating this phantom sickness with drugs or other therapies. The popular one is talk therapy, of which there seems to be no end. The patient becomes dependent upon the therapy and the therapist. And as long as they have this, they feel better. And in the psychological realm, it's called dependence. And it is a serious problem. It's a debilitating problem. The therapist is creating a dependence upon themselves. Hopefully not purposely. But there have been hundreds of movies and plays that have used that dynamic as either the plot or the subplot because it is so real. Therapists will argue that they're against this sort of thing, but their technique does encourage it. The more charactered therapist seeks to guard against it, even refusing to continue, telling the client, the patient, they must find another therapist. But the seeds are sown in the very fabric of the technique. You have a disorder. Definition, a disease of the mind. Or you are unable to handle the psychological aspects of life, relationships, doubts, fears, discouragement, guilt, whatever it may be. But all that misses the point. And the point is, if you don't do right, you won't feel right. Often it's a moral issue or a discipline, behavioral type issue. Fill your life with superficiality. Fill your life with prideful thinking, prideful behaviors, self-centered desires, temper tantrums, anger, deceit, lust, larceny, and all such self-oriented attitudes and behaviors, and you will never find peace. You will never find purpose or satisfaction. You will find disruption. And the disruption you find, you will then mislabel. Because the marketing is so strong. It'll either be everybody else or you will have a mental disorder. But we still haven't defined the mind, have we? How is my mind disordered? Through the centuries, since Freudian theory took hold, the mind has been equated with the brain. And early on, there were electroshock therapies where large amounts of electricity were applied to the brain in order to shock it back into order, back into rhythm, to, in a sense, reset it. They induced mini seizures, what we would call a problem, in order to resolve the problem. And all of that fell out of favor. It was in the 60s, I think, or 70s. Only to be revived again in the late 80s and 90s using a different approach. You see, we were doing it wrong. We're still going to hook cathodes up to your head and shoot you the juice, but we'll do it different. I can't remember whether they were hooking it up to one side then or now, but it was either the one side or the two sides, or I don't know. They figured it out. People who suffer from severe depression and or manic depression are candidates for this kind of treatment. And it comes largely out of despair when everything else fails. Some have found that it erased a great deal of memory, which in cases was kind of a cure all by itself. But the whole industry misses the mark because the brain is not the mind. And we're still talking about mental illness. You see, the mind is a non-physical part of our being. It's where the thoughts, the fears live. The decisions of life are not made in our brain. They're made in our mind. If I damage a portion of my brain so that I can't remember something, have I effected a cure? Or have I simply isolated that memory or that fear? Memories, fears that still exist, I just can't remember them because of the damage. And will I reproduce the same result as I move forward in life? Because nothing really has changed in my attitude, behavior, thought process, values. The mind is an immaterial part of our being. It's not a physical organ. In the Bible, it is associated with thought, decisions, intentions, opinions, purposes, intellect, understanding, orientation. To have a troublesome problem with my mind is to have allowed myself irresponsible and or false thinking over a period of time. Thinking which resulted in decisions that were not proper, not helpful, not productive, not godly. decisions that manifested themselves in behaviors or patterns that were ingrained, and they were false, destructive. Decisions that led me into dark places socially, physically, emotionally, spiritually, coloring my life with concepts and thoughts that were contrary to decency, respect, order, discipline, structure, productivity, character, morality, godliness. Filled with the non-productive and non-decent for years, it stands to reason I would be a little warped as to what's objectively right and good. And since irresponsible thinking leads to irresponsible living, and since all of this moves me away from God and from good order, you remember God, the one who created you? It stands to reason my life decisions would be less than perfect over time. Creating an alternative worldview that is morally, socially, financially, spiritually destructive, or just not good enough. And just so you don't misunderstand, being wealthy is not an indicator of moral integrity nor of spiritual soundness. The lives of the rich and famous are not filled with moral balance, social stability, physical strength, and mental soundness. But being wealthy is not the reason. In all of this, we have to approach the problems of life recognizing that it's not a mind or it's not a brain problem. And we have to understand the brain does not run our life. We have to understand this concept of mind that is immaterial, that includes our thought process, includes the decisions that we make, includes the values and the morality that is our reputation. But we have to understand the mind can be corrupted. The Bible says, with my mind I serve God. And my purposes, values, characters, decisions are all colored by that orientation. They flow out of what I'm serving. Without a stable spiritual orientation, my mind is free to wander into areas it ought not. And the world that I then view will be colored by thoughts and impressions that maybe aren't balanced. And that coloring affects my future decisions. The world is a word that describes Satan's kingdom. Adam gave him this world, authority over it, when he bowed to Satan's authority and defied God in the garden. He changed allegiance. Since that time, Satan has worked tirelessly to destroy Adam's seed. Satan hates human beings and therefore deny God his glory. A proper life, a godly life, is one that's lived in harmony with God's word. Failure to live that kind of life exposes us to Satan's world and Satan's values that are corrupt. They may be good, but they're not perfect. With all of that comes the chaos that we often identify as mental disease or mental disorder. Now, truly, there are some people predisposed to depression and to despair. Some of our great poets have been very depressed. David, King David, was depressive. And yet he accomplished a great deal with God's help. And he never denied God. And ultimately, he bowed before God. And in all of his failures, all of his rebellions, God never left him. There were times when God set him up straight and slapped him around a little bit. But David always responded properly, and God blessed him. God blessed David ultimately for God's own purposes. But he also blessed David for David's loyalty, because David never denied God. Because David ultimately carried out God's purposes and offered God his worship. Be careful when you walk into the psychological community. If you have to seek counsel, and your pastor can't give it to you, and there isn't godly people in your congregation who can help, have been through this, and they know how it works, there are counselors out there that are born again children of God and godly men and women. They're the ones you need to be talking to. If they've been trained in this world's system, they may be smarter than anything anybody knew. They may know all these. They don't know God. And that will make a difference when you're talking about the immaterial part of your being by which you serve your God.